Widowed rancher finds girl, tied to a cross with a sign, "Come back when you're perfect." The wind came in early, curling across the Wyoming plains like it carried secrets. Snow whispered through the tall dead grass, brushing against the fences like the hem of a grieving widow's dress. Out where the land met the horizon, morning hadn't yet arrived, just a slow grey light pressing against the dark. Thomas Hale had been up since before the frost glazed the window panes. He didn't sleep much anymore. Not since Eleanor passed. Not since the sound of her teacup no longer clinked in the morning silence. The house still smelled faintly of cedar and bread, though no fire had burned in days. A man could get used to quiet, but not this kind. This kind settled in your bones. He pulled on his coat, worn leather creaking like old limbs, and stepped onto the porch. The boards groaned. Rye, his old cattle dog, lifted his head from the step and gave a low whine. His ears tilted west, toward the ridgeline. Something was out there. Thomas narrowed his eyes. There was movement near the far pasture, a dark shape, crooked and still, where no shape should be. Crows circled above it, uneasy. He saddled the mule instead of the horse. He didn't need speed, just certainty. As he rode closer, the shape became clearer. A figure, standing, no, hanging, from a tall wooden cross, arms lashed out wide, head drooped to one side. The wind flapped a torn piece of cloth tied to the wood, a sign, scrawled in something dark. He didn't want to read it. Not yet. His boots sank into the snow as he dismounted. It was a girl, maybe 16, barefoot. Her clothes were thin and ripped, mud-streaked legs shivering in the morning cold. Her hands were bound with twine so tight the skin had broken, and nailed above her head on the cross's beam, barely clinging to the last breath of dignity, was a plank of wood with words scratched in anger. "Come back when you're perfect." Thomas didn't speak. He just reached into his coat and pulled out his knife. The twine resisted, as if it too wanted her to stay there. When her body slumped against him, light as dried wheat, he felt how brittle she'd become. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Her breath came like fog, soft and ghosted. He carried her to the mule and laid her sideways across the saddle, wrapping her in his coat. Rye followed, tail low, ears pinned back, as if he too knew something sacred had just been disturbed. Back at the ranch, the fire hissed to life again for the first time in weeks. The girl hadn't said a single word. She hadn't even asked where she was when she woke on the cot near the stove, tucked in an old quilt that smelled faintly of tobacco, thyme and pine. Her hands lay stiff at her sides, palms turned up, rope burns like angry red vines curling around her wrists. Thomas moved slow around her, not because he feared her, but because something about her silence demanded reverence, like she came from a place words couldn't reach. He'd placed a bowl of stew near her feet, warm and thick with barley and elk. She hadn't touched it. For 2 days the cabin lived in a hush. Thomas worked the stables, fed the chickens, mended a fence rail, all while keeping the door ajar so the girl knew she could walk out if she chose. She never did. Rye stayed near her most of the time, curled close enough for her to feel his breath on her ankles. She didn't pet him, but she didn't push him away either. On the third morning, Thomas found her in the kitchen corner, kneeling. Her hands shook as she tried to pour water from the tin jug. He didn't offer to help, just stepped around her, set a cup down beside her knees, and waited. She poured with both hands, drops trembling into the cup like confession. He watched her from the table as she drank. She gripped the cup with fingers that bore old scars, not the kind from accidents, but the kind that happen when someone learns the world has corners sharp enough to bleed from. Her feet were worse, calloused, purpled at the toes. Whoever had put her on that cross hadn't carried her there. She'd walked, or run. Thomas stitched up an old pair of Eleanor's socks and left them near the hearth. Later that night, he saw them pulled over her feet, half damp with melted snow. She had chosen to stay. By the end of the week, her appetite returned in small sips. Half a biscuit, then a full bowl of stew. She still didn't speak, but her eyes began to follow his movements. She flinched once when he reached to set firewood down beside her. Not because he touched her, he hadn't, but because his coat brushed the air too close. He stepped back, placed the wood down slower the next time. That night, as the fire hissed and wind coiled around the corners of the cabin, he asked gently, "What's your name?" She blinked. Her lips parted like they hadn't in months, then closed again. Instead, she reached for the end of the blanket and held it close, like she'd wrapped herself in the memory of a name once, but forgot how to wear it. Thomas didn't ask again. Outside, the snow had started up again, soft and steady. Inside, the warmth lingered between them, not from the fire, but from the slow way silence was beginning to heal. It was nearly 2 weeks before she spoke. Not a name, not a full sentence. Just one night, when Thomas laid a plate of cornbread and beans on the table and stepped back, she whispered, "Do you think God throws people away?" Her voice was dry, like driftwood scraped across stone. It barely reached across the table, but it hit him like a bell in an empty church. Thomas didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, not like she was broken, but like she was trying to grow through concrete. "No," he said at last, voice rough. "But I think people do." She nodded once, then chewed in silence. That was all she said that night. The next morning brought more than frost. As Thomas was chopping kindling out back, a dust trail curled down the ridge. A sheriff's truck, slow, deliberate, like it didn't want to scare anything off, but it would get there eventually. Thomas stepped out to meet it. Sheriff Langley was a man with shoulders like oak stumps, and a voice always one tone too official. "Tom," he said, removing his hat. "We got a report." Thomas didn't blink. "That right? Teen girl. Been missing a while. From across state lines. Real mess." "I see." Langley looked past him to the cabin. "You got someone here?" Thomas crossed his arms, voice low. "I got a soul healing by the fire. You here to put her back on a cross?" Langley hesitated, long enough to say he wasn't here to drag anyone off, but long enough to say he could. "She's got people?" Thomas asked. "Church folks, real strict. Said she ran off. Said she's a liar and dangerous." Thomas let out a slow breath, one hand resting on the handle of the axe. "I know that kind," he muttered. Langley shifted his weight. "I'll pretend I didn't find anything out here, but others'll come asking." When Thomas returned inside, he found her sitting at the edge of the cot, holding one of Eleanor's knitted scarves. She'd been listening. "I didn't steal anything," she said, voice clearer now. "I didn't do what they said." He didn't ask what they had said. He didn't need to. "I used to sing in their choir," she added. "They said my voice was a gift, until I said no to Pastor Merrick's son." Her hands were clenched now, small fists shaking against her knees. "He said I was born wrong, that I was tempting him." Thomas knelt slowly in front of her. "And what do you believe?" Her jaw tightened. "I believe I'm not the one who should be ashamed." He nodded, quiet. She hadn't cried, not yet, but her breath was starting to crack, and her chin trembled. Thomas placed a wool shawl around her shoulders and spoke only once. "You're safe here, until you say otherwise." And for the first time, her shoulders dropped, not in fear, but in release. Outside, the sheriff's dust had long settled, but inside the cabin, another kind of storm had just begun to pass. By the 3rd week, the snow began to melt in patches. The earth beneath turned dark and wet, breathing again after a long silence. But with the thaw came more than warmth. It brought eyes. They didn't knock on the door. Not yet. But Thomas could feel them. A rider had passed slow along the ridge 2 days in a row. Didn't wave. Just watched. At the feed store in town, folks paused longer between sentences when Thomas stepped in. Sheriff Langley had kept his word, but wordless things still travel fast. He saw it in the way young Micah Hodge looked at him, curious, hesitant, in the way Martha at the diner didn't pour coffee until he asked twice. They all remembered Thomas as the man who lost Eleanor and never came back the same. But now, someone had seen a shadow through his cabin window. A girl. A ghost, maybe. Or a rumor wrapped in wool. Inside the house, the girl had started to sweep the floor in the mornings, unasked. She washed the dishes with stiff fingers and fed rye scraps beneath the table. She hadn't told him her name yet, but she'd started humming when she thought he wasn't listening, soft notes that hung in the air like threadbare prayer. One morning, as Thomas loaded hay into the wagon, she appeared beside him and held up a folded cloth. It was one of Eleanor's old aprons, yellow, faded, stained from blackberry pies and bone broth. The girl held it with reverence. "May I?" she asked. Thomas only nodded. That afternoon, 2 children wandered up the trail. One had a slingshot hanging from his back pocket. The other held a jar of marbles. They weren't old enough to fear much. "Ma says you're hiding someone," the older one said. "A witch, maybe." Thomas didn't flinch. "You believe that?" The boy shook his head. "Don't think witches make soup." The girl stepped out onto the porch then, wiping her hands on the apron. Her eyes met theirs. The children didn't run. They just stared, not with malice, but with the quiet awe of seeing someone they'd heard stories about. "She doesn't look bad," the younger one whispered. "No," said Thomas. "She doesn't." The next day, someone left a bundle of firewood by the gate. No note. 2 days later, a sack of potatoes. Then a loaf of cornbread, still warm. No one rang the bell. No one claimed kindness. But something was shifting. Even the wind had changed. Not softer, but more curious. Like it was listening now. Thomas sat by the window that night, watching the last light drip down the mountains. The girl sat at the table, mending a tear in one of his flannel shirts. He knew the town might come knocking, might ask him to choose, their comfort or her dignity, but he also knew what it felt like to be abandoned in grief, to have your pain made inconvenient for others. He wouldn't do that to her, not even if it cost him the rest of his life, because in a world so quick to cast stones, choosing to stand beside someone was its own kind of resurrection. The confession came on a night when the wind had gone still. Thomas was whittling by the fire, a small cedar horse no bigger than a thumb. The girl sat across from him on the floor, her knees drawn to her chest, face lit only by the flame's flicker. She hadn't spoken much in 2 days. The house had grown quiet again, but not from fear, from the weight of something waiting to be said. "I tried to go back once," she whispered. Thomas looked up but didn't speak. "They had a meeting, sat me down in front of the elders, said I was born with a stain, said the pastor's son couldn't help himself, that I must have lured him." She swallowed hard, voice cracking. "They told me if I confessed, God would forgive me, that I could be made clean." Thomas set the carving down on the table. "I begged them to believe me. Begged them." Her fingers clutched the hem of the apron now, knuckles white. "But they said I had pride in me, that I needed to be humbled. So they tied me up, said it was love, said I'd thank them someday." She looked up, eyes shimmering. "I thought maybe they were right." Thomas didn't move, didn't offer comfort like a sermon or a fix. He just sat with it, the way a man sits with storm clouds he can't blow away, only share a roof with. After a long silence, he stood and walked to the mantel. From a small wooden box, he pulled something wrapped in velvet. He handed it to her without a word. Inside was a locket, silver, tarnished, warm from the box. She opened it. On one side, a woman's face, smiling beneath a sun hat. Eleanor. On the other, a name engraved in cursive. Grace. "She used to say," Thomas murmured, "that names aren't just labels. They're doors. Sometimes you need a new one when the old one's been burned." The girl stared down at it, hands trembling. He waited. Then, after a long breath, she whispered, "My name is Hannah." It hung in the air, fragile, new, alive. The fire crackled. Outside, the frost crept slow across the windows, as if pausing to listen. Thomas leaned back in his chair, voice low and steady. "Welcome home, Hannah." She didn't cry, but her shoulders dropped the way mountains do after centuries of holding back rivers, and in the hush that followed, she began to hum again. Not the song of a child afraid of silence, but one who finally knows someone's still listening. They came just after dawn, not with torches or guns, but with conviction wrapped in church collars and frost-bitten boots. 3 men from the neighboring town stood at the gate, arms crossed, faces drawn tight with certainty. One of them wore a badge, another held a Bible. The third held nothing, just his stare, heavy and cold. Thomas stood on the porch, coffee steaming in his hands, watching them like he'd been expecting the weather to change. "We're here for the girl," the man with the Bible said. "Her name is Hannah," Thomas replied calmly. "She doesn't belong here. She's not property. She's been corrupted," the third man spat. "Turned against truth, against the church, against her own blood." Inside, Hannah stood just out of sight behind the curtain, but she could hear them. And more than that, she could feel them, the way a tree feels the axe before it swings. "You're harboring a sinner," the badge holder warned. Thomas took a slow sip of coffee. "Maybe I am." The men shifted, surprised by his stillness. "You think this land belongs to you, Hale?" one growled. "No," Thomas said, "but she doesn't belong to you either." The wind picked up behind him, soft but certain, as if even the cottonwoods were leaning in to listen. "She's a child," Thomas continued, voice steady. "A child who was left to freeze on a cross so you could feel clean. You think that's justice?" "It was mercy." "No," he said, setting the cup down. "Mercy is when someone's broken and you kneel beside them, not when you break them further and call it grace." For a long moment no one spoke. The wind paused, then a creak behind him. Hannah stepped out. Her face was pale but calm. The bruises had faded, but the memory of them hadn't. She stood barefoot on the porch, Eleanor's yellow apron tied around her waist, hair tucked behind her ears, like she was ready to work the fields. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The men stared, not at her sins, but at the fact that she was still standing, still whole, still here. The sheriff glanced at her, then at Thomas. Something unreadable passed between them. "She's under your roof," he said at last. "Your burden now." "No," Thomas said softly. "She's under my care. There's a difference." One by one they turned, walked back to their truck, boots crunching through the old snow. They didn't look back. When the dust settled and silence returned, Hannah exhaled. Thomas didn't say anything, just opened the door and let her step inside first. Later that night, as the fire burned low and Rye snored by the hearth, she placed something beside his plate, the cedar horse he'd carved, now smoothed with oil and tied with a ribbon from her old dress. He touched it gently. Outside, the wind had changed again. It didn't whisper warnings anymore. It hummed, low, steady, like a hymn that didn't need words. Winter passed slowly that year. The snows came soft and late, like a curtain dropping gently over the last act of a long, bruised play. No one spoke much about the girl who had come from nowhere and stayed, but the deliveries at the gate never stopped. Eggs, cloth, sometimes even books wrapped in brown paper and twine. Life didn't change loudly. It shifted like ice melting under moss, quiet and sure. By spring, Hannah had planted a row of herbs along the porch. She'd begun to laugh sometimes too. Short, startled laughs, like she'd forgotten what it felt like until it spilled out of her. She sang again. Never the same song twice. Never full voice. Just little fragments, while sweeping, or boiling water, or walking with Rye along the ridge. But Thomas heard them, and when he did, he paused whatever he was doing and listened. One evening, as the sky pinked into soft lavender and the fields breathed in dusk, Hannah placed something on the mantel. It was a letter, folded once, neat and square. Thomas opened it the next morning, alone. The handwriting was careful, the kind that had been scolded into her bones. "I'm leaving for the valley. I want to be where no one knows me yet, where I can choose who I am from the start. I don't hate them, but I can't belong to them anymore. You gave me silence that didn't hurt. That's more than most ever gave me. I'll send word when I build something worth coming back to." Hannah, beneath the letter, she'd left the locket. Not because she didn't want it, but because she understood. Some memories are meant to stay where they were first made whole. Thomas didn't chase her. He just stood on the porch the next morning, watching her figure get smaller between the cottonwoods, one step at a time, wrapped in Eleanor's old shawl, Rye trotting a few paces behind until he finally stopped and sat. She turned once, and in that turn, there was no fear, only promise. That night, Thomas sat by the fire, alone again, but not hollow. The house still smelled of stew and pine and soft wool. The cedar horse sat near the hearth, beside the locket. Outside, snow began to fall, gentle and slow, as if the sky itself had forgiven something it had been holding in for years. And in the hush between crackling embers and wind-bent branches, a new kind of silence settled over the cabin. Not the silence of grief, not the silence of exile, but the silence of peace, the kind that lingers when a name is spoken, and finally, believed.